Well, I started at the University of Huddersfield in 1971 and did more than 50 years there. I became Professor of History, then Diamond Jubilee Professor. I'm now Diamond Jubilee Professor Emeritus. In addition to that, I'm visiting Professor at York St John. I'm Associate Editor of Labour History, Labour, an international journal, which is one of the biggest. It earns a lot of money for Taylor and Francis. And I've written or edited 50, I think it's something like 27 or 28 monographs and 22 or 3 collections. I've done lots of external examining and all sorts of things in my life. But if you look at my publications, quite a lot on Labour history, the Independent Labour Party. I've got one there, which came out on the Independent Labour Party. Communist Party, the Red Flag, got 2 on the Communist Party, Under the Red Flag. General Strike, Day by Day, I've also another book on the General Strike. And I've also got an interest in working class sports and activities, going to the dogs, which is greyhound racing, of course. And of course, even though it's got the same cover, this is another different book. It's Football Pools and the British Working Class. I suddenly realised nobody really written a book properly on the football pool, so I just decided to do that. So I've written on the ILP, Centennial History of the Independent Labour Party. I've written a book on the history of British trade unionism. I've obviously written, as I've said, books on the General Strike. So that's my sort of background. Currently, I'm writing an article and a book on Eric Heffer. But we'll see where that goes, but because it's a vast topic, there's a lot of material. And I'm trying to write, but it's already at 270,000 words of documents, which I've typed up. It'll probably end up with nearly 500,000 or 600,000. I thought I'd try to explain my involvement in socialist activities in the 60s. So I thought I'd look at Trotskyist groups, non-Trotskyist Marxist groups and others. And I've titled it basically A Trot Around the Left, but how, it might take me 20 years to do that and might well be dead before it's finished. But anyway, that's how it's. So I'm interested in trade unionism, labour, socialist histories of gambling, and I've got a book on gambling, 2 books on gambling, in fact, and other things as well. So that's the range that I've been involved in. So, and I do quite a lot of public lectures. I mean, you may not, I know the camera doesn't lie, but I am nearly 79 in 3 weeks' time, when I will be at Cheltenham Racecourse.
Yeah, well, happy birthday for that. Where would you describe yourself as coming from?
I would say that my background would be, politically, I'd be Harold Wilson Labour, which makes me pretty left-wing these days. Wilson, in many ways, was to the left of Jeremy Corbyn. It's just that it was presented in a different way. So I think that's where I am. I was probably, in the old days, 60s, I'd probably be described as centre Labour. Although I did edit at Bradford University, there were a group of mathematicians who formed an IS group, International Socialist Group, and they couldn't type and they couldn't write, really. So I used to edit their material in a journal called Orbit, because the watermark on the sheet of paper, on the typing paper, but it took them light, it said Orbit. So we call it Orbit. And I did that. I did about 12 or 13 issues. I sort of typed it up, rewrote some of their stuff because it wasn't terribly good sometimes and so forth. I was at that time, of course, a member of the Labour Party. I never joined IS and I've been described many times, would you believe, as a Trotskyist. I've never been a Trotskyist in my life, but it's usually a communist or the old communists who would, if they review something, said this is a Trotskyist interpretation. It isn't. If you criticise the Communist Party, you usually become described as a Trotskyist. So I would say politically, I'm not a member of the Labour Party. I joined it in 1964, October 1964. Harold Wilson had just got in power. My first meeting in Barnsley was somebody turned up and said, I hope there's going to be no McDonaldism here. And I had no idea who Ramsay MacDonald was at that time. I left in 1994 when Clause 4 became something I couldn't remember. It was changed from the original. Clause 4 was never meant to be strictly interpreted in that way. It was a belief in some sort of public ownership. But now it's become some sort of commitment to liberalisation, and I'm not happy with that. Having said that, I mean, and I don't agree with Blair on many issues, I would accept that the most powerful, able politician in the West, certainly, who I've come across in the last 30 years, is Tony Blair. But I disagree with him, but I can't argue against that. I mean, he's got to be, Anyway, I think that's probably enough about myself, my position, and whatever.
However, was specifically, when you say, I understand you explain that politically, what is your background? Where you?
Sorry.
How would you describe yourself?
Well, my father was a miner. I was born in 1946 in Barnsley. My father was born about 1924 in Montbretton near Barnsley. So I was raised, I was born in a hospital, Beckett's Hospital, and then I was raised at Kendry for 6 months, and then we lived, until I was 60, we lived at Montbretton. And the fields between Montbretton and where we moved to Ardsley were where they did a lot of Kess. A lot of the film over Kess was done there. So I was in that area. I was a bright working class lad, but very few kids went to grammar school in Barnsley, only 8%. And so I think, I know because I was monitor, I was 12, I'd missed out on the 11 plus. The average IQ to go to university at that time was about 110. My IQ was 127, but only 8% went to Barnsley. So I did a 12 plus and I got 130. And when the new grammar school opened, so I went to the new grammar school, Broadway Technical Grammar. And it's quite a challenge in the sense that you're a working class family going into a middle class environment. Less relevant now, but certainly very relevant then. And then I went on, did A-levels, got 2 A's and a B at A-levels in the days when it was just straightforward A's and B's and not all the rest of it. At O-level, I got 85% in history, so that was where I was going to go. But GCSE these days, but it's not the same. And I always remember my head teacher, Mr. Nolan. Other people, there was a middle-class lad who'd gone in to see him before. He'd got 3 C's, and he came out, he said, Mr. Nolan said, you'll go far, lad. When I went to see him, 2 A's and B, he said, don't be too ambitious, lad. Well, I thought, I'm going to kick that. So I went to Bradford University, and then I went to Manchester for a teacher training. Well, I got the diploma of the Victoria University of Manchester. That's its official document, because it was part of the old Victoria University of Leeds, Liverpool and Manchester. And then I went on, I did an MA at Lancaster University, got a distinction in social history. And then I moved on and got a PhD at Lancaster University, and then started at Huddersfield in 71. In fact, I started there before I finished my PhD. And that's really sort of my background.
Okay.
Barnsley football is the other background, if that's of any interest to you. My grandfather and my grandmother, Laybourn, are in Montbretton Cemetery, 4 graves up from Tommy Taylor's grave. And I knew Tommy Taylor because there's a picture of me on his knee. He was brought up by his auntie and uncle, not his father and mother, in Montbretton. He was a lovely man, but killed at, age of 26, was it? Born in 1932, yeah, 26. One of the greatest footballers. Played 18 times for England, saw 16 goals. Not bad, by anybody's standard. So that's my background. I'm interested, I wouldn't say passionate, but I'm interested in football. I like sports. I'm from a working class background. So, I rose and the first person in my family to go to university, the first to get a degree and whatever, 3 degrees. So far, the most successful, but I think I might have some grandkids who might overtake me. You never know.
He's hoping.
He's hoping. And in 1824, a body of 37 weavers form a union in Manningham. And they form, it's called the Union to begin with. And in 1825, they call for not wage increases, although people often refer to that. What they refer to is the need to equalise wages for weavers and woolcombers. And the result was that a person called John Tester led them in industrial action from June to November, about 23 weeks or something like that, in 1825. And they got a lot of support. It's raised about £15,000, about £600 from Bradford, £1,100 or £1,200 from London. Different parts of the country came in. And generally speaking, it's argued that 2,000 or 3,000 children and perhaps 2,000 or 3,000 adults were affected in that strike. You get all sorts of different figures, but that tends to be the thing, wild exaggerations, whatever. Now, that strike was not successful. Well, it wasn't successful in getting equalisation of wages. What it did, it was to get the union recognised. And they didn't get wage increases, they didn't get equalisation of wages. And that in 1825, that was the situation. What happened after that is that within a few months, unemployment had increased in Bradford, and people like John Tester left to find work elsewhere. And the union struggled on. I think it done a very small strike in 1827, but it struggled on for 2 or 3 years and then just collapsed. But that's not unusual because, I was thinking of the Saddleworth weavers. I had documents somewhere on them. Thank goodness I got some photocopies somewhere on them because they can't find their records now. But they were formed in 1828 and collapsed in 1830 because, as the one account says, there was much money in there, and the officials, effectively, they're arguing that they decamped with the money. They had no bad time of it, I think is the actual phrase. And that's one of the problems, you see. One of the problems of unions, if you're not legal bodies, you can't protect your funds. You can't take, as a union, you can't take somebody to court, your treasurer to court, for running off with the money because you're not a legal body. Which is why unions, when they began to emerge, often used to put their money from an individual to perhaps somebody running a pub, a publican. And then you've got an individual claim against the publican if he goes off with the money. But if you were a trade union and doing that, you have no rights. Now, really what happened after the 1825 strike is you've got a few thousand workers organising from time to time, but Bradford never has many. In 1884, the Spen area, the Batley, Dewsbury and Huddersfield, there was a formation of a union, the West Riding Power Loom Weavers Association, which became the General Union. It went through various titles until it became the National Union of Textile Workers in the time of the First World War. And what happened is that there was a big strike. They got some concessions, not much really. And obviously there's union organisation beginning to occur. So part and parcel by the late 1880s was the growth of new unionism, the semi-skilled and unskilled workers getting together. The result was the growth of trade unionism in Bradford, as with the rest of the country. You probably had 3,000 people in the Trades Council in 1888. You had about 10,000 in 1892. And what happened is that these trade unions increasingly became susceptible to socialist influence because they could point out that the employers couldn't care less. John Field, a printer, in 1888 was preferred by the Liberals to Sam Shafter, who was a Liberal, the Trades Council president, was preferred. And John Field was an unfair employer. He didn't pay trade union rates. So, that gives you the sort of sense. And this sort of thing was happening on a small sort of scale elsewhere. So when the Independent Labour Party was formed in Bradford as the Bradford Labour Union in 1891 and so forth, they began to drift in that way. But what really gave the stimulus to Bradford trade unionism wasn't just that. It was in 1890 to 91, December 1890 to April 1891, there was the biggest strike in Bradford and area for a long time, the Manningham Mills strike. Now, Manningham Mills, if you know Bradford, is a dominating feature of the landscape. And it's now, I think, been turned into flats, but it was a place which employed, say, 3,000 people, perhaps up to 15,000 in the First World War, but about 3,000, mainly doing worsted and silk, and therefore you produce velveteens, silk, velvet, basic velveteens, high quality material. Now you've got to remember, most mills in Bradford are not large. You've got Salts on the outskirts of Bradford, Saltaire. You've got you've got Manningham Mills, but you've also Samuel and Lifter, but you've also the Illingworths, who became ultimately later on Illingworth Morris, but they had the Wetley Mills and so forth. And you've got to remember, some of these firms, are built up. I mean, Daniel Illingworth set up Illingworths in 1820 odd, and he was a worker. He almost worked alongside people. His workers. There wasn't that distinction until 1825 to 30, with that collapse of the relationship. That's when Bishop Blaise Fair, everybody used to go to Bishop Blaise, 1825, February 1832, 1 7-year septennial, never occurred. So things had changed. But these big mills were employed a few thousand. The average worsted mill employed about 70, and the average woolen mill about 30. So, it's untypical. These are untypical of what was in Bradford. There were a few larger mills, but by and large, it's small mill material. Now, Manningham Mills was the biggest, and Samuel Cunliffe Lister introduced his own machines, the Lister nip and on combing and so forth, built up that mill from the 1870s. It burnt down in the 1870s. They rebuilt it, and it's Manningham Mills today. And what happened is that with Lister, a lot of his trade was to America. Now, in 1890, they got to know that the Americans would be introducing tariffs, the McKinley tariff. There was the Wilson tariff and then the McKinley. But the McKinley sort of added 50% to the cost of goods going in because of the tax. So what Lister did, who became Lord Masson later on, what Lister did was to, build up that mills, everybody producing overtime the lot to get stuff into America before the tariff comes down. And the minute the tariff came down in December 1890, suddenly it's 15 to 25% wage reductions in one fell swoop. Now, like Salts, there were a few unions that came from time to time, silk unions, but they disappeared. In Manningham, there'd been the odd union that came and flitted in and flitted out. And they weren't organised. But what they did was to force out one section of the workers and then another until they built it up to try to break the strike. But what happened is that the general union, as it became, the West Riding Power Loom Weavers, decided to come in and organise the workers. And they were led by a chap called W.H. True. And I have a picture, I don't know if it would come out of him. Here's a picture of a meeting with the ILP. And you've got Ben Tillett, the trade unionist there. You've got Fred Jowett. You've got Tom Mann. And you've got W.H. Drew. You've got some of the leading figures. Now, W.H. Drew, down there, I don't know if you can see him, was the organiser. And what he did was to really get the workers organised, because there were great difficulties. You couldn't, the employers and who were represented on the council stopped the workers meeting in various halls. There was a place called the Star Music Hall. They were going to meet there. No, you'll lose your licence if you allow these workers in. So there was a lot of that. And so they had open air meetings at Peckover Drive area, Peckover, and they were stopped, and it was almost it was a class conflict there. Now, what happened is that the strikers were out for 19 weeks. And at the end of the dispute, there was disturbances. There was a meeting at St George's Hall where Tom Mann, Ben Tillett, the great trade union leaders of the day, Keir Hardie, all attended in April. I think it's about 15th or 16th. Anyway, mid-April. And then there was supposed to be a meeting outside, gathering outside. Now, the place where they gathered used to be called, I'm not sure if it's still called that, Norfolk Gardens, but it was originally known as Dockers Square. And it's between the Town Hall and St George's Hall. It's that section which they're pedestrianising now. And there was a meeting there. Well, the police tried to break it up. Was it Chief Constable Withers, and others tried to break it up, but they haven't enough numbers. So they bring in the military from Manchester and other areas. And the Riot Act is read. And Edward Roche, who was a typographer and ILPer and that, said it was like they chased people with fixed bayonets up. I think he's exaggerating, but he said that in fixed bayonets up Highgate in Bradford. It's like scenes from the French Revolution. Anyway, that died down and the workers were effectively forced back. But really what happened is that leading the figures like W.H. Drew, George Minty, James Bartley, a chap called Leach, Willie Leach, who became a member of the Labour government in 1924. These sort of people decided that they would form a political Labour union called the Bradford Labour Union in May 1891 at Laycock's, off Hearths or whatever. I think it was Laycock's at the time. They kept changing their name. There's a beautiful quote, and that is, there've been two parties in the past. The can'ts, that's the Liberals because Home Rule comes first, and the won'ts, that's the Conservatives. Time that we had a party that will, the ILP Labour Party as it became. And so really the Trades Council became very much dominated very quickly by the ILP, Independent Labour Party. By 1892, it's really representative. Later on, there's a division in the sense that the Trades Council forms the Workers' Municipal Federation. The ILP are separate, but they work together. They are the same people, at large. So they work together. And so really in the 1890s, the Manningham Mill strike, I think Edward Palmer Thompson once said that in fact the Manningham Mill strike was the beginning of the political Labour movement, the Independent Labour Party. In defeat, there was victory. In Bradford, you've got to remember there's a fallback, but when you look at trade unionism in Bradford, you're looking at skilled unions by and large. The most, it's the engineers, it's the typographers, it's the, skip and basket makers, it's that sort of thing. When you actually come to the textile workers, the average spinner and weaver is not unionised. Weavers are more likely to be unionised than spinners because a lot of the spinners are women. And increasingly, a lot of, you are talking 2,000 or 3,000, well, actually only talking a few thousand for the West Riding. The General Union, as it became, the West Riding power loom operators who became the General Union, 10, 20,000. Well, you've got 250,000 people or more to organise, and it is small. So it's always weak. And that's the feature, really, of textile unions rather than skilled sections. The dyers might get a few thousand workers, 3, 4, 5, 6,000, etc. So then we come on, really, in a sense, that when you get strikes, the small scale, the employers often win, I think, rather than the trade unionists. And then we come on to the First World War. And in the First World War, there was obviously a demand for wool and for mustards of uniforms, whatever. And wool control, of course, was set up in Bradford. But what happened is people felt, obviously, there was a need to produce for the war. And coal was taken over, wool was controlled, etc. And what happened is that J.H. Whitley, MP for Halifax, one of the two MPs for Halifax, later on Assistant Speaker and then Speaker of the House of Commons, he put forward a scheme which became known as the Whitley Councils. Now, not many developed anywhere. Civil service kept them for years. There were some in one part of the building trade for a time, but textiles operated through Whitley Council from 1916 to the 1930s, when it more or less collapsed. The idea was to bring employers and employees together, or their representatives together, to conciliate or arbitrate on disputes. And in the wartime situation, that worked reasonably well because you got people being paid, and then there was a war bonus because of inflation, etc. But after the war, most of that began to collapse. In 1920-21, the Whitley Councils presided over reductions in the wage rates, which are very complex in textiles. Nobody ever really understood them. Not even the people who looked into them later on. But there was sort of 5% down on that sort of thing. And 20 or 21, I think, was the last reduction. And then there was nothing. The Whitley Council arbitrated on various things in textiles until 1926 or 25, when the dispute occurred. What happened is that in 1925, there was a desire by the government to return to the gold standard. In the First World War, we'd gone off free trade and therefore gold standard, payments in gold, transferring from one vault in the City of London to another, or the Bank to another. And what happened is that when Churchill introduced the return to the gold standard after 7 years, he did it, but he did it at the wrong rate. The value of the pound before the war being 4.86 to the dollars to the pound. It had gone to 2.86, aimed to get back at 4.86, but it was only 4.46. So he took it back at 4.86. The meaning of that is very simple. You're selling goods to foreign countries, but you're asking for 10% more. Your prices are higher. And of course, that created problems in the coal industry, which is why the coal miners were threatened with reductions in 1925, which ultimately, in its way, led to the 1976 general strike. But also, the textile industry, there was a desire to cut the wages. And the employers came in, basically, I suppose it's difficult to get the price things, but basically with a reduction. Well, the unions wanted an increase, and the employers wanted a decrease of 5%. And the Whitley Council discusses these in 24 and 25, but obviously, in 24 and then 25, but they're going nowhere with it. There's no, the Whitley Council doesn't seem to be working very well, and if you're constantly having cuts, you're not going to trust that arbitration, that conciliation, are you? If it's all one way, one side's going to say, hey up, enough's enough. And really, in a sense, that's what occurred. And then it all built up a few months after the return to the gold standard. At the same time, in fact, the very day that the lockouts were announced, I'll come back to those, 5 unions, stuff pressers and the various things, all came together to form a new organisation, a new trade union. Prior to that, the National Union of Textile Workers had been formed a few years before to bring some of these organisations together. Also, there was an association, the National Association of United Textile Trades, which went beyond wool. It was wool and worsted and wool, and also cotton. So really, in a sense, you had a building up of amalgam. So you're getting trade unions beginning to organise better. You're getting employers wanting a wage reduction. You're getting the Whitley Council not working. And what happens is that eventually the employers announce it's announced on the 24th of July that in fact they will put on the gates of the textile mills the announcement of a lockout. Well, basically, don't come to work unless you accept these new conditions. Sounds a little bit like some of our television companies and whatever. But that's basically what happened. Now, as you know, it's a Friday, so the actual strike really starts on a Monday, properly on a Monday. And what we have is what is referred to often as the 1925 wool strike, which is actually correctly a wool lockout. Workers aren't striking, the employers are locking them out unless they accept new conditions. And immediately, the first estimates are 132, 138,000 workers are out, mainly in Bradford. Bradford, to begin with, was given 80,000 as its figure. A week later, it's down to 50,000. Halifax, 10,000, and so forth. It comes to about, I think it's 132 or 138, but the 2 or 3 sets of figures appear, and they're all slightly different. Later on, they discriminate between workers who are out of work and those employers who have not imposed the new conditions. So in Bradford, 50,000 by the end of July, 50,000 workers are out, but 10,000 are still in work because their notices have not been issued. And so what you've got is a dispute on. Now, there's a little bit of violence here and there in Canal Road, etc., Union Mills and other areas in Bradford, but not a lot. It's a very well organised strike. And the main point about it, I mean, it's led, the figure who was the leading figure in it, leading the what is the General Union, keeps changing its name, but the General Union is, of course, Ben Turner, later on Sir Ben Turner of Dewsbury, who became president of the Trade Union Congress in the late 20s, and he gives his name to the Turner-Mond talks between the TUC and the big companies, big companies in the 1928, really, that sort of period. Now, Ben Turner is the leading figure, but there are other people, Harris Hoyle, a chap called Dawson, Arthur Dawson, and all sorts of different people. There are attempts to bring this conflict together. The main ones are made a couple of times by a chap called J.H. Palin. Now, you may not have heard of him, but Palin worked in Bradford. He was a general labourer and then a railway man. He was president of the Amalgamated Society of Railway Servants in 1900-1901, who were found guilty by the House of Lords introduced the Taff Vale judgment, when thereafter, if you came out on strike, the union would have to pay the losses of the employers. So he was a very important person. He became MP. He was very important. He was the one who, in 1914, made a very famous speech about the Independent Labour Party, its 21st year. Of ordinary historical association, Bradford has none. In Doomsday Book it was described as a waste, but successive periods of capitalist exploitation have done little to improve it. But in 1922 he became an MP for Newcastle East. And in 1925 at the time, I don't know how I combined the duties, he was actually Mayor of Bradford. And so he must have been a councillor, a mayor, or became a mayor, and was still an MP. And it's a big, important person, Palin. Michael Palin, same spelling, Palin. And he tried to bring the sides together. It didn't work. Ultimately, what happened is that chap called Leggett, representing the government, brought the two sides together about the 10th of August. By the 15th, 16th of August, there's an agreement that they will set up a commission of investigation to examine the situation, and effectively the lockouts are called off. In between time, of course, a lot of employers haven't been involved, and some employers have actually said, look, we'll withdraw our notices. They've also been in the meantime lots of meetings at Savile Park and other areas in Halifax, at not Fairweather Green, but in Bradford at Peckovers and so forth. There's been lots of meetings, and the result eventually was a commission set up. I think it's August the 17th. It meets I think it meets September the 21st, 2nd, 3rd, and one day in October, and sometime in mid-October it produces its reports. 3 volumes of it. I have looked at them, and I understand what Philip Snowden said, because there were representatives, not directly involved in each side, representatives for the employers and the workers. Philip Snowden was one of the representatives for the workers' side. Well, it became Chancellor of the Exchequer. Well, he was 24 and 29 to 31 for the Labour government. E.F. Wise, a statistician, economist, expert at Oxford, ILP of the lot, was another. And they looked at this material, and I concur with what Snowden said. It's unintelligible how to work out the wage rates in textiles. If you've got day employment, that's easy, but most of it is by piece, length, thinness, and so forth. If you're in cotton, because cotton's involved, the finer the cotton, you're going to get more mileage out of a pound of cotton. It's more difficult to bring out that thread, because that thread is likely to break. You need skilled people to do it. And it is complex. And I looked through the records, and I agree with what was said. We cannot come to a conclusion. We can't understand the system. So the conclusion of this arbitration was, leave it as it is. And in a sense, the point about that is that probably 132, 138,000, not the 250,000, because not everybody was out, workers who were involved, their conditions were not changed. They weren't improved, but they weren't changed. And you've got to think about the same time what's happening. 2 things are happening. One is that apart from the there's the wool strike. Wool lockout, I should say, lockout rather than strike. Everybody calls it strike. I don't know why. The success there, and it's occurring, remember, at the same time as the coal miners, the attempt by the coal owners to reduce the wages of the miners by 10%. Now, that was smoothed over because the government came with us in a subsidy on the 31st of July 1925, which is often referred to as Red Friday. But it sets up a commission and 9-month subsidy, and of course 9 months later you've got the coal dispute begins again and the general strike. So it was occurring at an important point. And then you've got the wool, and remember, the coal miners are tremendously well organised. The vast majority, 90-odd%, if not more, are in unions. If they're in employment, they are in unions. There was probably 100,000 who weren't in unions because they weren't in employment, but they are well organised. You look at the textile workers, badly organised, but they've succeeded. They've fought off the attempt by the employers to reduce their wages. In the wake of that, by the end of 25, the TUC says, we've had 2 great victories against the wage reductions that have gone on since the First World War. And those wage reductions have been fought off. The greatest victories in recent trade union history, that sort of thing. That's the sort of statements they're making. And so they produce a new journal called Trade Union Unity. And one of the articles in the first edition was written by Alderman Ben Turner, later Sir Ben Turner, president to become of the TUC, etc. And it said, basically, it's saying, if a badly organised union like ours, or trade like ours, can beat off the employers, anybody can do it. And the whole theme was unity. Now, during the coal lockout, coal dispute, because it didn't come to that, the miners at the same time provided some money, loans and money, for the wool workers who were out, because obviously I think think it's something like £30,000 or £40,000 they have to raise to keep people going, to provide some strike pay. And that sort of established, I think, a link between the textile workers and other groups in Bradford and the coal mining community. So in 1926, we have, 9 months later, we have the end of the subsidy, and the coal owners demand wage reductions and lengthening of hours. The TUC on the 3rd of May, a minute to midnight, on the 3rd of May, announce that they announced a day or two before, but the general strike, or a strike in support of the a national strike in support of the coal miners. It was never referred to as a general strike, although that became the term that people used, because the general strike has revolutionary connotations, which they didn't want. What happens is you'll find that the textile workers in Bradford are never called out. They're not seen as the vital workers. They're second line workers. The first line workers, the printers, the railway men are called out in support of the miners. They're never called out. But what happens is that a lot of textile workers are actually come out. They're advised to go back. The Trades Council try to keep control, but they're not called out, but they do come out, and they do provide some financial support for the miners. So, there is an involvement, even though it's not a strike, textile strike, in 1926.